The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Berkshire Historical Society, casting long shadows across rows of archival boxes that had remained untouched for decades. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell adjusted her reading glasses as she carefully lifted the lid from a container marked 1900-1910, her fingers trembling slightly with the anticipation that came with every new discovery. For 15 years, she had served as the lead archivist at this institution, dedicating her life to preserving the stories of ordinary people who had shaped the rugged landscape of the American Northeast. The Society had recently received a substantial grant to digitize their entire photographic collection, a project that would bring these forgotten images into the modern age and make them accessible to researchers worldwide. Eleanor had volunteered to oversee the initiative personally, knowing that each photograph held secrets waiting to be unveiled by patient eyes and careful restoration. As she sorted through yellowed envelopes and brittle cardboard frames, Eleanor's hands moved with practiced precision, her mind cataloging each image by date, location, and subject matter. The collection contained thousands of photographs documenting life in the Berkshire Mountains during the turn of the 20th century, from family portraits taken in makeshift studios to candid shots of workers building the railroad that would connect isolated communities to the broader world. She had seen countless images of stern-faced farmers, children playing in streams, and women in long dresses standing before wooden houses that no longer existed. Each photograph was a window into a vanished world, a moment frozen in time that spoke of hardships endured, joys celebrated, and lives lived far from the spotlight of history. Eleanor believed deeply that these images deserved to be seen, studied, and remembered, but they told the true story of America better than any textbook ever could. The afternoon wore on as Eleanor worked methodically through the collection, setting aside particularly interesting or well-preserved images for priority scanning. Her assistant, a young graduate student named Marcus Chen, had set up the digital restoration equipment in the adjacent room, where high-resolution scanners and specialized software would breathe new life into faded emulsions and damaged negatives. The process was painstaking but rewarding, as modern technology could recover details that had been invisible to the naked eye for over a century. Eleanor had witnessed remarkable transformations during previous digitization projects, watching as faces emerged from darkness and landscapes revealed features that time had obscured. She approached each photograph with reverence, understanding that she might be the first person in generations to truly look at these images, to consider the people within them as real individuals with hopes and fears rather than anonymous figures from a distant past. Near the bottom of the third box, Eleanor discovered a large format photograph mounted on thick cardboard, its edges worn, but its surface remarkably intact considering its age. The image showed a group of 7 people posed on a rocky outcropping high in the mountains, their clothing and postures suggesting a hiking expedition or surveying party from the early 1900s. The photographer had captured them against a dramatic backdrop of distant peaks and valleys, the composition carefully arranged to showcase both the human subjects and the magnificent wilderness that surrounded them. Eleanor noted the date penciled on the back in faded script, September 1903, Mount Greylock Expedition. The names of 6 individuals were listed below, their surnames, familiar to anyone who knew the history of the region, prominent families who had built mills and founded towns throughout the Berkshires. She set the photograph aside with particular care, sensing that this image would be one of the highlights of the digitized collection, a perfect example of the adventurous spirit that had characterized the era. As closing time approached, Eleanor gathered the selected photographs and carried them to the scanning room, where Marcus was calibrating the equipment for the next day's work. She placed the mountain expedition photograph on top of the stack, pointing out the exceptional clarity and composition that made it worthy of special attention. Marcus nodded enthusiastically, already imagining how the image would look once the restoration software enhanced its contrast and brought out details hidden in the shadows. Eleanor felt a familiar satisfaction as she locked the archive room and prepared to leave for the evening, unaware that the photograph she had just selected would soon challenge everything she thought she knew about historical documentation. The image seemed ordinary enough, a simple record of people enjoying the natural beauty of their homeland, but within its borders lay a mystery that would consume her thoughts for months to come and force her to question the reliability of photographic evidence itself. Marcus arrived early the next morning, eager to begin the scanning process With the mountain expedition photograph that Eleanor had prioritized, he positioned the image on the flatbed scanner with meticulous care, ensuring that it lay perfectly flat to avoid any distortion in the digital capture. The scanner hummed to life, its bright light passing slowly beneath the glass as it recorded every detail of the century-old emulsion at a resolution far exceeding what the human eye could perceive. Within minutes, the photograph appeared on his computer screen, magnified to several times its original size, revealing textures and nuances that would have been impossible to see in the physical print. Marcus began the restoration process, using specialized software to remove dust spots, repair minor scratches, and adjust the tonal range to compensate for fading that had occurred over the decades. The work required patience and a delicate touch, as overly aggressive corrections could destroy the authentic character of historical photographs and introduce anachronistic elements that would mislead future researchers. As Marcus worked on enhancing the contrast in the shadowed areas of the image, he noticed something peculiar in the lower right corner, just beyond the group of posed figures. The original photograph had appeared to show nothing but rocky terrain and scattered vegetation in that area, but as he adjusted the shadow detail slider, a distinct shape began to emerge from the darkness. At first he assumed it was simply a rock formation or perhaps a piece of equipment that the expedition members had set down while posing for the photograph. However, as he continued to refine the image, the shape became increasingly defined, and Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what he was seeing. The form was unmistakably a human shadow, long and distorted, as if cast by someone standing at an angle to the sun, but there was no corresponding figure visible in the photograph. He zoomed in further, examining the shadow with growing unease, noting how it fell across the rocks with the same directionality as the shadows cast by the 7 people in the frame. Marcus called Eleanor over to his workstation, his voice tight with confusion as he pointed to the anomaly on the screen. She leaned in close, her eyes narrowing as she studied the shadow that seemed to belong to an 8th person who simply was not there. Her first instinct was to assume a technical error, perhaps a glitch in the scanning process or an artifact introduced by the restoration software, but Marcus assured her that he had checked and rechecked his work, even rescanning the original photograph to confirm that the shadow existed in the physical print itself. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken as she considered the implications of this discovery. In all her years working with historical photographs, she had encountered many oddities and unexplained elements, but nothing quite like this. The shadow was too well defined to be a simple trick of light or a chemical anomaly in the developing process, and its position relative to the other shadows in the image suggested that it had been cast at the same moment the photograph was taken. They spent the next hour examining every inch of the photograph, searching for any explanation that might account for the mysterious shadow. Eleanor suggested that perhaps someone had been standing just outside the frame, their shadow extending into the visible area while their body remained hidden. But the angle seemed wrong for that interpretation. Marcus proposed that the shadow might belong to the photographer, but the position of the camera and the direction of the light made that theory equally implausible. They considered the possibility of double exposure, a common occurrence in early photography where 2 separate images were accidentally superimposed on the same plate, but the rest of the photograph showed no signs of such an error, and the shadow integrated seamlessly with the surrounding terrain. As they exhausted one rational explanation after another, Eleanor felt a growing sense of unease that she tried to suppress with professional skepticism. She had built her career on rigorous methodology and evidence-based research, and she was not about to abandon those principles because of a single anomalous shadow in an old photograph. Eleanor decided to research the expedition itself, hoping that historical records might provide context that would explain the shadow's presence. She pulled out the Society's card catalogue and began searching for references to Mount Greylock expeditions in September 1903, finding several newspaper articles that mentioned a surveying party led by prominent local businessman Theodore Ashworth. The articles described the expedition's purpose as mapping potential routes for a new mountain road and noted that the party had included Ashworth's daughter, Catherine, his business partner, James Whitmore, and 4 experienced guides from the region. Eleanor cross-referenced the names penciled on the back of the photograph with the newspaper accounts, confirming that 6 of the 7 people in the image could be identified with certainty. However, she noticed something troubling as she compiled her notes. The newspaper articles mentioned only 6 people in the expedition party, yet 7 figures appeared in the photograph, and now there was evidence of an 8th person whose shadow had been captured, even though their body had not. She sat back in her chair, staring at the list of names and trying to make sense of the discrepancy, wondering if she had stumbled upon a minor historical error or something far more significant. Over the following days, Eleanor immersed herself in researching every detail of the 1903 Mount Greylock expedition, driven by a compulsion to solve the mystery that had taken root in her mind. She combed through local newspapers from that autumn, finding additional articles that described the expedition's successful completion and the valuable survey data it had produced for the planned mountain road. The coverage was uniformly positive, praising Theodore Ashworth's vision and the skill of the guides who had led the party safely through challenging terrain. However, Eleanor noticed that none of the articles provided a complete list of participants, instead referring vaguely to Ashworth and his companions, or the surveying party, without specifying exact numbers. She expanded her search to include personal correspondence and business. Records from the Ashworth family papers, which the Historical Society had acquired decades earlier from a descendant who had been cleaning out the family estate. The collection filled 3 large boxes and included everything from business ledgers to personal letters, a treasure trove of information about one of the region's most influential families. As Eleanor worked through the Ashworth papers, she discovered a leather-bound journal that had belonged to Catherine, Ashworth, Theodore's daughter, who had been 23 years old at the time of the expedition. The journal entries from September 1903 provided a day-by-day account of the mountain journey, written in elegant script that revealed Catherine to be an educated and observant young woman with a keen interest in natural history. Eleanor read through the entries with growing fascination, learning details about the expedition that had never appeared in the newspaper. Coverage. Catherine described the challenging ascent, the breathtaking views from the summit, and the camaraderie that had developed among the party members during their days in the wilderness. However, as Eleanor reached the entry dated September 15th, the day the photograph had been taken according to the notation on its back, she found something that made her breath catch in her throat. Catherine had written about the photograph being taken, describing how the party had posed on a rocky outcropping while their photographer set up his equipment, but she mentioned feeling uneasy during the session, as if they were being watched by unseen eyes. The journal entry continued with Catherine describing a strange incident that had occurred immediately after the photograph was taken. She wrote that as the group began to disperse from their posed positions, one of the guides, a man named Samuel Blackwood, had suddenly pointed toward the edge of the outcropping and asked if anyone else had seen the figure standing there. The other members of the party had looked in the direction he indicated but saw nothing, and Samuel had seemed confused and embarrassed, apologizing for his outburst and attributing it to a trick of the light or perhaps fatigue from the climb. Catherine noted that the incident had cast a pall over the remainder of the day, with Samuel becoming withdrawn and refusing to discuss what he thought he had seen. Eleanor felt a chill as she read this passage, immediately connecting it to the mysterious shadow in the photograph. She turned to the list of names on the back of the image and confirmed that Samuel Blackwood was indeed one of the 7 people visible in the frame, standing near the right edge of the group, close to where the unexplained shadow appeared. Eleanor decided to investigate Samuel Blackwood's background, hoping to learn more about the man who had claimed to see something that no one else could perceive. She searched through census records, city directories, and newspaper archives, gradually piecing together the story of a man who had worked as a mountain guide and wilderness expert throughout the Berkshires during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Samuel had been born in 1875 to a family of modest means, growing up in a small village at the base of Mount Greylock and learning the mountain trails from his father, who had worked as a logger and trapper. By his mid-20s, Samuel had established a reputation as one of the most reliable guides in the region, known for his knowledge of the terrain and his ability to navigate safely through difficult conditions. However, Eleanor discovered that Samuel's life had taken a dark turn in the months following the 1903 expedition. Newspaper articles from early 1904 reported that he had become increasingly erratic and withdrawn, telling strange stories about encounters with mysterious figures in the mountains and refusing to work as a guide any longer. The final piece of information Eleanor found about Samuel Blackwood came from a brief obituary published in March 1904, Just 6 months after the expedition photograph had been taken, the notice stated that Samuel had died in a fall while hiking alone on Mount Greylock, his body discovered by a search party after he had been missing for 3 days. The obituary was perfunctory and offered no details about the circumstances of his death, but Eleanor noticed that it had been placed in the newspaper by the Ashworth family rather than by Samuel's own relatives. She found this detail curious and troubling, suggesting a connection between Samuel's death and the expedition that the historical record had not preserved. As she sat in the archive room surrounded by documents and photographs, Eleanor felt the weight of a story that wanted to be told, a narrative that had been buried beneath a century of silence and forgetting. The shadow in the photograph was no longer just an optical curiosity, but a clue to something darker, a mystery that had claimed at least one life and had been carefully concealed by people with the power to control what history remembered. Eleanor knew that she needed expert analysis of the photograph before she could proceed further with her investigation, so she reached out to Dr. Raymond Foster, a forensic photography specialist at the State University who had assisted the Historical Society with authentication issues in the past. She explained the situation carefully, describing the shadow anomaly and the historical context she had uncovered, and Raymond agreed to examine the photograph using advanced imaging techniques that could reveal details invisible to conventional analysis. 2 days later, Eleanor drove to the university with the original photograph secured in an archival sleeve, her mind racing with possibilities about what Raymond's examination might reveal. She found him in his laboratory, a cluttered space filled with cameras, computers, and scientific equipment that seemed more suited to a police forensics unit than an academic setting. Raymond greeted her warmly and immediately set to work, placing the photograph under a specialized microscope that could examine the structure of the photographic emulsion at a microscopic level. For the next 3 hours, Raymond conducted a battery of tests on the photograph, using techniques that Eleanor only partially understood, but that she trusted implicitly based on his reputation and expertise. He examined the paper stock and confirmed that it was consistent with materials used in the early 1900s, ruling out the possibility of a modern forgery. He analyzed the chemical composition of the emulsion and found no evidence of manipulation or alteration, no signs that the image had been retouched or that multiple negatives had been combined to create a composite. He used infrared and ultraviolet imaging to look for hidden details or erasures, techniques that could reveal changes invisible under normal light, but the photograph appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be, an authentic image, captured in a single exposure on a September day in 1903. Finally, Raymond focused his attention on the mysterious shadow itself, measuring its dimensions, analyzing its density, and comparing it to the other shadows in the frame to determine whether it was consistent with the lighting conditions that had existed when the photograph was taken. When Raymond finally looked up from his equipment, his expression was troubled in a way that Eleanor had never seen before. He explained that the shadow was absolutely real, not an artifact of scanning or digital processing, not a chemical anomaly or a trick of development, but an actual shadow that had been present when the photograph was exposed. Moreover, his analysis confirmed that the shadow was consistent with all the other shadows in the image in terms of direction, length, and density, meaning that it had been cast by something or someone standing in the same light at the same moment. However, there was no corresponding figure visible in the photograph, no person or object that could have produced such a shadow. Raymond admitted that in 20 years of forensic photography work, he had never encountered anything quite like this. He had seen plenty of anomalies in historical photographs, from double exposures to chemical stains that resembled human forms, but this was different. The shadow followed all the physical laws of light and perspective, yet it appeared to have been cast by something that either was not there or that the camera had somehow failed to record. Eleanor felt a mixture of vindication and dread as she listened to Raymond's conclusions. Part of her had hoped that he would find a simple explanation, some technical detail that would resolve the mystery and allow her to file the photograph away as an interesting curiosity. Instead, his analysis had only deepened the enigma and lent scientific credibility to what might otherwise have been dismissed as imagination or error. She shared with Raymond the information she had discovered about Samuel Blackwood, the guide who had claimed to see something on the day the photograph was taken and who had died under mysterious circumstances 6 months later. Raymond listened intently, his scientific skepticism warring with the evidence before him, and finally suggested that Eleanor should try to locate the original glass plate negative if it still existed. He explained that examining the negative would provide even more definitive information about the shadow and might reveal details that had been lost in the printing process. Eleanor realized that she had not yet searched for the negative, having assumed that it had been lost or destroyed in the decades since the photograph was taken, but Raymond's suggestion gave her a new direction for her investigation. Back at the Historical Society, Eleanor began a systematic search through the photographic storage areas, looking for any glass plate negatives from the 1903 time period. The Society's collection included thousands of negatives stored in custom-built cabinets designed to protect the fragile glass from breakage and deterioration, but the cataloging system was incomplete, and many negatives had never been properly identified or cross-referenced with their corresponding prints. Eleanor spent days carefully examining plates, holding them up to the light and searching for images that matched the mountain expedition photograph. The work was tedious and often frustrating, as many negatives had been damaged by time or careless handling, their emulsions cracked or peeling away from the glass substrate. She was about to give up hope when she discovered a wooden box tucked away on a high shelf in the oldest section of the storage room. The box was labeled with the name Ashworth in faded ink, and inside she found 24 glass plate negatives wrapped in tissue paper, each one carefully preserved and protected from the elements. Eleanor's hands trembled as she unwrapped each glass plate negative, holding them up to the light streaming through the storage room window and examining the reversed images captured in their emulsions. Most of the plates showed family portraits and images of the Ashworth estate, formal compositions that documented the wealth and status of one of the region's most prominent families. Near the bottom of the box, she found a larger plate that made her heart race the moment she saw it. Even in negative form, she recognized the composition immediately: the rocky outcropping, the 7 posed figures, the dramatic mountain landscape stretching into the distance. This was the original negative of the expedition photograph, preserved in the Ashworth family collection for over a century, and somehow overlooked by previous archivists who had processed the donation. Eleanor carefully extracted the plate from its tissue wrapping and carried it to the light table in the conservation lab, where she could examine it more closely without risk of damage. As the backlight illuminated the negative, she saw with perfect clarity that the mysterious shadow was present in the original exposure, ruling out any possibility that it had been added during the printing process or that it was an artifact of the paper print she had been studying. She immediately contacted Raymond and arranged to bring the negative to his laboratory for the same rigorous analysis he had performed on the print. This time, Eleanor stayed throughout the entire examination process, watching as Raymond used even more sophisticated equipment to study the glass plate at a molecular level. He confirmed that the negative was authentic, its emulsion consistent with photographic materials available in 1903, and that it showed no signs of manipulation or double exposure. The shadow was embedded in the original image, captured by the camera at the moment of exposure, and it corresponded exactly to the shadow visible in the paper print. Raymond then did something that Eleanor found both fascinating and unsettling. He created a 3-dimensional computer model of the scene based on the positions and lengths of all the shadows in the photograph, using the known height of the sun at that date and time to calculate where each person had been standing relative to the camera and to each other. The model revealed that the mysterious shadow had been cast by something approximately 6 feet tall, standing just outside the right edge of the frame, in almost exactly the spot where Samuel Blackwood had pointed when he claimed to see, a figure that no one else could perceive. The implications of Raymond's analysis were staggering, and Eleanor found herself grappling with questions that seemed to belong more to philosophy than to historical research. If the camera had captured a shadow cast by something that was invisible to the human eye, what did that say about the nature of photographic evidence and its relationship to reality? She had always believed that photographs were objective records of the past, mechanical reproductions of light and form that could be trusted in ways that human memory and testimony could not. But this photograph challenged that assumption, suggesting that cameras might sometimes record things that observers present at the scene could not see, or conversely, that they might fail to record things that were actually there. Eleanor discussed these questions with Raymond late into the evening, both of them struggling to reconcile their scientific training with the inexplicable evidence before them, Raymond finally suggested that perhaps the shadow belonged to someone who had been standing in that spot moments before the exposure was made. Their shadow somehow burned into the scene even after they had moved away. But he admitted that this explanation violated everything known about how photography worked. Eleanor returned to the Historical Society with more questions than answers, but she was now certain that the photograph represented something significant that deserved serious investigation, rather than dismissal as a curiosity or anomaly. She decided to expand her research beyond Samuel Blackwood and the Ashworth expedition, looking for any other unusual incidents or unexplained phenomena associated with Mount Greylock during that time period. What she discovered in the newspaper archives shocked her and suggested that the mysterious shadow might be connected to a much larger story that had been deliberately suppressed. In October 1903, just 1 month after the expedition photograph was taken, a brief article had appeared in the local paper reporting that several hikers had gone missing on Mount Greylock under mysterious circumstances. The article provided few details, but noted that search parties had been organized and that the missing individuals were experienced outdoorsmen who knew the mountain well. Eleanor found follow-up articles reporting that 2 of the missing hikers had eventually been found alive, confused and disoriented, but unable to explain what had happened to them or where they had been during the days they were missing. More disturbing were the articles she found from November and December of that year, reporting additional disappearances and strange encounters on the mountain. One article described a hunting party that had fled the mountain in terror, claiming they had been followed by something they could not see but could hear moving through the forest around them. Another article mentioned a surveying crew that had abandoned their work after several members reported seeing shadowy figures that vanished when approached. The articles treated these incidents with a mixture of skepticism and sensationalism, suggesting that the witnesses had been drinking or had fallen victim to superstition and imagination. However, Eleanor noticed that the coverage abruptly stopped in January 1904, right around the time that Samuel Blackwood had died in his fall on the mountain. After that date, there were no more articles about strange occurrences or disappearances on Mount Greylock, as if someone had decided that such stories were no longer suitable for publication. Eleanor suspected that the Ashworth family, with their considerable influence over local media and institutions, had intervened to suppress coverage that might damage tourism or property values in the region. The silence that had descended over these events had lasted for more than a century, and Eleanor was now in a position to break it. Eleanor decided that she needed to present her findings to someone outside the Historical Society, someone who could provide an independent perspective and help her determine the best course of action. She reached out to Dr. Patricia Mendoza, a professor of American history at a prestigious East Coast university who had published extensively on the social and cultural history of rural New England. Patricia had a reputation for taking unconventional historical sources seriously and for being willing to challenge established narratives when evidence warranted it. Eleanor sent her a detailed email outlining the discovery of the shadow in the photograph, the forensic analysis that had confirmed its authenticity, and the historical context she had uncovered about Samuel Blackwood and the strange incidents on Mount Greylock in 1903 and 1904. She attached high-resolution scans of the photograph and copies of the relevant newspaper articles and journal entries, hoping that Patricia would see the significance of what she had found and agree to help her investigate further. Patricia's response came within 24 hours, and her enthusiasm was evident even through the formal language of academic correspondence. She wrote that the photograph and its associated documentation represented exactly the kind of historical mystery that deserved serious scholarly attention, and she offered to visit the Berkshire Historical Society to examine the materials firsthand and discuss potential avenues for research. 2 weeks later, Patricia arrived at the society, an energetic woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an infectious curiosity about the past. Eleanor spent an entire day walking her through the evidence, showing her the original photograph and glass plate negative, sharing Catherine Ashworth's journal entries, and explaining the timeline of events that had followed the expedition. Patricia listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed her deep knowledge of the period and her ability to see connections that Eleanor had missed. By the end of the day, Patricia was convinced that they were dealing with something genuinely significant, a historical mystery that touched on issues of perception, evidence, and the ways that communities respond to phenomena they cannot explain. Together, Eleanor and Patricia developed a research plan that would take them beyond the archives and into the field, literally retracing the steps of the 1903 expedition and searching for additional evidence that might shed light on the mysterious shadow. Patricia had connections with colleagues in anthropology and folklore studies who might be able to provide context for the strange incidents reported on Mount Greylock, and she suggested that they should also try to locate descendants of the expedition members who might have family stories or documents that had never been donated to public archives. Eleanor felt energized by Patricia's involvement, grateful to have an ally who took the mystery seriously and who had the academic credentials to ensure that their findings would be treated with respect, rather than dismissed as sensationalism. They agreed to co-author a paper on their research, with the understanding that they would follow the evidence wherever it led, and that they would not shy away from conclusions that might challenge conventional historical methodology. Their first step was to organize an expedition to Mount Greylock, following the route described in Catherine Ashworth's journal and attempting to locate the exact spot where the 1903 photograph had been taken. Eleanor recruited Marcus to join them, knowing that his technical skills would be valuable for documenting their findings and for comparing modern photographs of the location with the historical image. They set out on a crisp autumn morning, the mountain air sharp and clean, as they began the ascent along trails that had changed little in the century since the Ashworth expedition had passed this way. Patricia had brought copies of topographical maps from 1903, and they used these, along with Catherine's detailed descriptions, to navigate toward the rocky outcropping that had served as the backdrop for the photograph. The hike took most of the morning, and as they climbed higher, Eleanor found herself thinking about Samuel Blackwood and the other guides who had made this journey so many times, wondering what they had seen or experienced that had driven some of them to abandon their profession and retreat from the mountain they had once known so well. When they finally reached the outcropping, Eleanor felt a shock of recognition, even though she had never been to this spot before. The view was exactly as it appeared in the photograph, the same distant peaks and valleys stretching toward the horizon, the same arrangement of rocks and sparse vegetation. Marcus immediately began setting up his camera equipment, taking multiple photographs from different angles, and using GPS coordinates to mark the exact location for future reference. Patricia walked slowly around the outcropping, examining the ground and the surrounding area, looking for anything that might provide a clue to what had happened here in September 1903. Eleanor stood near the center of the space where the expedition members had posed, trying to imagine the scene as it had unfolded, the photographer arranging his subjects, the moment of exposure, and then Samuel Blackwood pointing toward the edge of the outcropping and asking if anyone else had seen the figure standing there. She turned to look in the direction where the mysterious shadow had fallen, and as she did, she felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air, a sensation of being observed by eyes she could not see. Marcus called out that he had found something, and Eleanor and Patricia hurried over to where he was crouching near the eastern edge of the outcropping. He pointed to a series of marks carved into the rock face, weathered by a century of exposure, but still clearly visible once you knew where to look. The marks appeared to be symbols or letters, crudely scratched into the stone with a sharp tool, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken as she recognized one of the letter combinations as the initials SB. Samuel Blackwood had left his mark here, and the other symbols surrounding his initials suggested that he had been trying to communicate something, to leave a record of what he had witnessed or experienced. Patricia photographed the carvings from multiple angles, while Marcus used digital enhancement techniques to make the weathered marks more legible. As they studied the symbols, a pattern began to emerge. The carvings included what appeared to be a date, March 7th, 1904, which Eleanor immediately recognized as just days before Samuel's death, and a series of marks that might have been an attempt to draw or diagram something that Samuel had seen. The discovery of the carvings transformed their understanding of the timeline and suggested that Samuel had returned to this spot multiple times after the original expedition, perhaps trying to make sense of what he had witnessed or attempting to document something that he knew others would not believe. Eleanor felt a deep sadness as she imagined Samuel coming back to this isolated place, driven by an experience that had shattered his sense of reality and that he could not share with anyone who would take him seriously. The date of the carvings indicated that he had been here just days before his fatal fall, and Eleanor could not help but wonder whether his death had truly been an accident or whether something else had happened on that final visit to the mountain. Patricia suggested that they should search the area more thoroughly, looking for any other evidence that Samuel or the original expedition might have left behind, and for the next 2 hours they combed the outcropping and the surrounding terrain, examining every crevice and overturning rocks in hopes of finding additional clues. It was Eleanor who made the next significant discovery, finding a small cairn of stones tucked into a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging rock about 30 yards from the main outcropping. The cairn had clearly been built by human hands, its stones carefully stacked in a way that would not occur naturally, and when Eleanor carefully dismantled it, she found a metal box wrapped in oilcloth buried beneath the rocks. Her hands shook as she unwrapped the box and pried open its rusted lid, revealing a bundle of papers that had been protected from the elements by their waterproof covering. The papers included several pages torn from a journal, covered in handwriting that Eleanor recognized from other documents as belonging to Samuel Blackwood. Patricia and Marcus gathered around as Eleanor carefully unfolded the brittle pages, and they read together the words that Samuel had written in what appeared to be the final days of his life, a testament that he had hidden away because he knew that no one would believe him if he tried to share it openly. Samuel's hidden journal entries described a series of encounters on Mount Greylock that had begun on the day the expedition photograph was taken and had continued with increasing frequency in the months that followed. He wrote that when he had pointed toward the edge of the outcropping and asked if anyone else had seen the figure standing there, he had not been experiencing a trick of the light or a moment of fatigue-induced confusion. He had seen, clearly and unmistakably, a person standing in that spot, a figure that appeared solid and real but that somehow the other members of the expedition could not perceive. The figure had been watching them, Samuel wrote, and when their eyes had met, he had felt a jolt of recognition or connection that he could not explain. In the days and weeks after the expedition, Samuel had returned to the mountain repeatedly, drawn by a compulsion he did not fully understand, and each time he had encountered the figure again, sometimes at a distance, sometimes close enough that he felt he could reach out and touch it. The figure never spoke, Samuel wrote, but it communicated somehow, conveying feelings and impressions that Samuel struggled to put into words. The final entry in Samuel's hidden journal was dated March 6, 1904, the day before he had carved his initials and the symbols into the rock face, and 2 days before his death. In this entry, Samuel wrote that he finally understood what the figure was trying to show him, that it was not a ghost or a spirit, but something else entirely, something that existed alongside the world that humans perceived, but that remained invisible to most people most of the time. He wrote that the figure had shown him places on the mountain where the boundary between worlds grew thin, where someone with the right kind of perception could glimpse what lay beyond the ordinary realm of experience. Samuel's final words were both exhilarating and terrifying in their implications. He wrote that he was going to cross over, to step through one of these thin places and see what lay on the other side, and that he was leaving this record in case he did not return, so that someone might eventually understand what had happened to him. Eleanor looked up from the pages with tears in her eyes, understanding now that Samuel's death had not been an accident at all, but a deliberate choice, an act of courage or madness or perhaps both, driven by an experience that had fundamentally altered his perception of reality. The discovery of Samuel Blackwood's hidden journal created an immediate dilemma for Eleanor and Patricia as they considered how to present their findings to the academic community and the general public. The photograph with its mysterious shadow was strange enough, but it could be discussed in terms of optical phenomena and the limitations of early photographic technology without venturing too far into territory that might damage their professional credibility. However, Samuel's journal entries pushed the story into realms that most historians and scientists would dismiss as fantasy or delusion, the ravings of a man who had suffered some kind of mental breakdown in the months before his death. Patricia argued that they had an obligation to present all the evidence they had found, including Samuel's own account of his experiences, and to let readers draw their own conclusions about what had happened on Mount Greylock in 1903 and 1904. Eleanor agreed in principle, but worried that including the more extraordinary claims from Samuel's journal would undermine the credibility of their research and make it impossible for other scholars to take their work seriously. They spent weeks debating how to frame their findings, consulting with colleagues in history, anthropology, and psychology to get perspectives on how Samuel's experiences might be understood and contextualized. Some of the scholars they consulted suggested that Samuel might have been suffering from a neurological condition that caused visual hallucinations, while others proposed that he had been experiencing a form of religious or mystical vision shaped by the cultural beliefs of his time and place. A few colleagues, particularly those who studied folklore and anomalous phenomena, took Samuel's account more seriously and pointed to similar stories from other times and places where individuals had reported encounters with beings or presences that existed outside normal perception. Eleanor found herself increasingly sympathetic to this latter perspective, not because she believed in supernatural explanations, but because she recognized that dismissing Samuel's experiences as mere delusion failed to account for the physical evidence of the shadow in the photograph and the careful, rational tone of his journal entries, even as he described events that seemed impossible. Patricia proposed that they should write two separate papers. One focused strictly on the photograph and its forensic analysis, which could be published in a mainstream historical journal and would establish the basic facts of the mystery without venturing into more controversial territory, and a second paper that would include Samuel's journal entries and would explore the broader questions raised by his experiences. This approach would allow them to present their findings to different audiences and would protect Eleanor's position at the Historical Society while still ensuring that the complete story was told. Eleanor agreed to this plan, and they set to work drafting the first paper, which they titled Anomalous Shadow in E. 1903 Expedition. Photograph, Forensic Analysis, and Historical Context. The paper meticulously documented the discovery of the photograph, the scientific testing that had confirmed its authenticity, and the historical research that had revealed the connection to Samuel Blackwood and the strange incidents on Mount Greylock. They submitted the paper to the Journal of American Historical Photography, a respected peer-reviewed publication, and waited anxiously for the reviewers' responses. The paper was accepted for publication after minor revisions, and it appeared in print 6 months after their expedition to Mount Greylock. The response from the academic community was immediate and intense, with scholars from multiple disciplines weighing in on the mystery and proposing various explanations for the shadow. Some researchers argued that the shadow must have been cast by a piece of equipment or a natural feature that happened to resemble a human form, while others suggested that there had been an eighth person present who had somehow been excluded from the historical record. A few scientists proposed exotic explanations involving atmospheric phenomena or unusual properties of the photographic emulsion that might have caused it to record shadows differently than expected. The debate was vigorous but remained within the bounds of conventional academic discourse, and Eleanor was relieved that their work was being taken seriously rather than dismissed as pseudoscience or sensationalism. However, she knew that the real controversy would come when they published the second paper, which would include Samuel's journal entries and would force readers to confront questions that could not be answered through conventional historical or scientific methods. Before publishing the second paper, Eleanor and Patricia decided to make one more attempt to find additional evidence that might corroborate Samuel's account or provide alternative explanations for his experiences. They reached out to descendants of the other expedition members, hoping to find family stories or documents that might shed light on what had happened on the mountain. Most of the families they contacted had no relevant information to share, but Eleanor eventually connected with a great-granddaughter of Catherine Ashworth, who had inherited a box of family papers that had never been donated to any archive. The woman, whose name was Jennifer Ashworth Chen, invited Eleanor to her home to examine the papers, and what Eleanor found there would prove to be the final piece of the puzzle that had consumed her life for the past year. Among the papers was a letter that Catherine had written to her father, Theodore, in April 1904, just weeks after Samuel Blackwood's death, in which she confessed that she had also seen the figure that Samuel had pointed to on the day the photograph was taken, and that she had lied when she claimed to see nothing because she was afraid of being thought mad or hysterical. Catherine's letter to her father was a revelation that changed everything Eleanor and Patricia thought they knew about the Mount Greylock mystery. In careful, measured prose that reflected her education and social position, Catherine described how she had seen the figure standing at the edge of the outcropping with perfect clarity, a person who appeared as solid and real as any of the expedition members, but who somehow did not belong to their world. She wrote that she had been terrified by what she saw, and even more terrified by the realization that no one else except Samuel seemed able to perceive it. When Samuel had asked if anyone else had seen the figure, Catherine had remained silent, choosing social conformity over truth, because she understood that admitting to such a vision would mark her as unstable or unreliable in the eyes of her family and community. The letter revealed that Catherine had been haunted by her silence, particularly after Samuel's death, and that she had written to her father seeking guidance about whether she should come forward with her account or continue to keep her experience secret. Theodore Ashworth's response to his daughter's letter had been preserved along with Catherine's original, and it provided crucial insight into how the mystery had been suppressed and why the historical record had been so carefully sanitized. Theodore wrote that he believed Catherine had indeed seen something unusual on the mountain, and that he himself had heard stories from other reliable witnesses about strange phenomena in that area going back many years. However, he counseled Catherine strongly against speaking publicly about her experience, arguing that doing so would damage her reputation and marriage prospects and would also harm the family's business interests by creating fear and superstition about the mountain region they were trying to develop. Theodore's letter made clear that he had used his influence to suppress newspaper coverage of the strange incidents on Mount Greylock, and that he had arranged for Samuel Blackwood's death to be reported as a simple hiking accident rather than the mysterious disappearance it had actually been. The letter ended with Theodore assuring Catherine that her secret was safe and that the family would never speak of these matters again. Eleanor felt a complex mixture of emotions as she read these letters, understanding now how a combination of social pressure, economic interests, and genuine fear had conspired to bury a story that deserved to be told. Catherine Ashworth had lived with her secret for the rest of her life, never speaking publicly about what she had seen, but preserving the evidence in her private papers in hopes that someday someone would understand. Jennifer Ashworth Chen, Catherine's descendant, gave Eleanor permission to include the letters in their research, saying that she believed her great-grandmother would have wanted the truth to finally come out. With this new evidence in hand, Eleanor and Patricia completed their second paper, which they titled Bearing Witness to the Invisible, the Mount Greylock Phenomenon and the Limits of Historical Evidence. The paper presented Samuel's journal entries and Catherine's letters alongside analysis from scholars in multiple fields, exploring questions about perception, reality, and the ways that societies deal with experiences that fall outside accepted frameworks of understanding. The second paper was published in a journal that specialized in interdisciplinary approaches to historical mysteries, and it generated far more controversy than the first had. Some scholars praised Eleanor and Patricia for their courage in presenting evidence that challenged conventional assumptions about the nature of reality and the reliability of eyewitness testimony. Others criticized them for giving credence to what they saw as obvious delusions or fabrications, arguing that the proper historical approach would be to explain away Samuel's and Catherine's experiences in terms of known psychological or social phenomena. The debate spilled over from academic journals into popular media, with newspapers and websites running stories about the mysterious shadow photograph and the century-old mystery it represented. Eleanor found herself giving interviews and lectures about the case, always careful to present the evidence without claiming to have definitive answers about what Samuel and Catherine had actually experienced. The publicity surrounding their research had an unexpected consequence. Dozens of people came forward with their own stories of strange experiences on Mount Greylock and other locations in the Berkshire Mountains. Some of these accounts were clearly influenced by having read about the 1903 incident, but others included details that seemed to corroborate aspects of Samuel's and Catherine's descriptions, suggesting that whatever phenomenon they had encountered might still be occurring in the present day. Eleanor and Patricia collected these contemporary accounts and began a new phase of research, working with scientists and researchers from various disciplines to investigate whether there might be some natural explanation for the experiences people reported. They explored theories involving electromagnetic fields, infrasound, and other environmental factors that could potentially affect human perception, but none of these explanations fully accounted for the consistency and specificity of the reports they were receiving. The mystery remained unsolved, but Eleanor took satisfaction in knowing that she had brought it to light and had given voice to people like Samuel Blackwood, whose experiences had been dismissed and forgotten by history. 5 years after the discovery of the mysterious shadow photograph, Eleanor stood once again on the rocky outcropping where the 1903 expedition had posed for their picture. She had returned to this spot many times since that first research expedition with Patricia and Marcus, and each visit had deepened her connection to the place and to the people whose story she had helped to recover. The outcropping had become something of a pilgrimage site for people interested in the mystery, and the Historical Society had installed a small plaque describing the 1903 expedition and the questions that remained unanswered about what had occurred here. Eleanor had mixed feelings about the attention the site had received, worried that commercialization and tourism might somehow diminish the significance of what had happened, but she also recognized that bringing the story to public awareness had been the right choice, honoring the courage of Samuel Blackwood and Catherine Ashworth, who had witnessed something extraordinary and had paid a price for their honesty. The academic debate about the Mount Greylock phenomenon had continued over the years, with new researchers bringing fresh perspectives and methodologies to the investigation. A team of physicists had conducted extensive measurements at the outcropping and other locations where unusual experiences had been reported, looking for anomalies in electromagnetic fields or other environmental factors that might explain the phenomenon. They had found some interesting variations in local magnetic fields that correlated with geological features, but nothing that could definitively account for the visual experiences that witnesses described. A group of psychologists had studied the personality traits and cognitive styles of people who reported seeing figures or presences that others could not perceive, finding that these individuals tended to score higher on measures of creativity and openness to experience, but showed no signs of mental illness or impaired reality testing. The research had raised as many questions as it answered, but Eleanor appreciated that the mystery was being investigated seriously rather than dismissed or ridiculed. Patricia had gone on to write a book about the case, titled Shadows on the Mountain, a mystery of perception and reality in early 20th century America, which had become a surprise bestseller and had introduced the story to a much wider audience. The book carefully presented all the evidence Eleanor and Patricia had gathered while avoiding sensationalism and respecting the complexity of the questions involved. Patricia had dedicated the book to Samuel Blackwood and Catherine Ashworth, acknowledging their courage in bearing witness to experiences that their society was not prepared to accept or understand. Eleanor had contributed a chapter to the book describing the process of discovering and authenticating the photograph, and she had been gratified by the response from readers who appreciated the meticulous historical research that had gone into reconstructing the story. The book had sparked renewed interest in other historical mysteries and anomalous phenomena, encouraging historians to take seriously accounts that had previously been dismissed as folklore or superstition. For Eleanor personally, the investigation had transformed her understanding of what it meant to be a historian and what responsibilities came with that role. She had learned that sometimes the most important stories were the ones that had been deliberately suppressed or forgotten, and that recovering these stories required not just technical skill and scholarly rigor, but also empathy and imagination. She had come to see Samuel Blackwood not as a victim of delusion or mental illness, but as a pioneer who had encountered something at the edges of human experience and had tried to document it as carefully and honestly as he could. Catherine Ashworth had shown equal courage in a different way, preserving evidence of her experience, even though she could not speak about it publicly, trusting that future generations might be more open to understanding what she had witnessed. Eleanor felt honored to have been the person who had finally brought their story to light and had given them the recognition they deserved. As the sun began to set over the Berkshire Mountains, casting long shadows across the outcropping where Eleanor stood, she thought about the photograph that had started everything. The image of 7 people posed against a mountain landscape with an 8th shadow that belonged to no one visible in the frame. The photograph remained in the collection of the Historical Society, carefully preserved and frequently requested by researchers and journalists who continued to study the mystery. Eleanor had looked at that image hundreds of times over the years, and she still felt a thrill of wonder and unease each time she saw the shadow, that undeniable evidence that something had been present on that September day in 1903, something that the camera had recorded, even though most of the witnesses could not see it. She did not know what that something was, and she had come to accept that she might never know with certainty. But she knew that the mystery mattered, that it pointed toward aspects of reality and human experience that deserved to be taken seriously, rather than explained away or ignored. As darkness fell over the mountain, and Eleanor began her descent back to the trailhead, she felt grateful for the journey that the mysterious photograph had taken her on, a journey that had taught her that history was not just about recovering facts and dates, but about honoring the full complexity of human experience in all its mystery and wonder. The shadow in the photograph would continue to puzzle and intrigue future generations, and Eleanor took comfort in knowing that Samuel Blackwood and Catherine Ashworth would not be forgotten, that their courage in witnessing and documenting the inexplicable would inspire others to look more carefully at the world around them and to remain open to possibilities that conventional wisdom insisted could not exist.